Sometimes we just overcomplicate things. We just make things more difficult than they need to be. I mean, I'm guilty of this. Chief among them, I'm guilty of this. I mean, there are some times where my wife will ask me to do something simple around the house, and then I will over-research it. I will over-ask questions. And the next thing I know, the day slipped away from me because instead of just keeping something simple, I've just overcomplicated it. And then it turns from literally like a 2-hour project into like a 3-day long project. And the whole time my wife just smiles and very patiently and kindly and lovingly reminds me that, Shane, sometimes you overcomplicate things. You make them more difficult than they need to be. And I feel like a lot of times Christians do this when it comes to evangelism. When it comes to sharing the gospel, we just overcomplicate it. So we think that in order to share the gospel, we have to have all of these, apologetic arguments ready to go so that if any question is asked, we're able to answer it right away. Or we think that we have to have all of these passages and, this Roman road where I lead you from this Roman passage to that Roman passage to eventually into the baptistry. Or we think we have to have all of the theology figured out, or all of the different ways in which you can share the gospel and methods. And eventually I just come to a point and I say, hey, Christians, I think we're overcomplicating this. I think we're making this more difficult than it needs to be. And sometimes what I have found is that I overcomplicate things because I'm insecure. Because I actually don't feel confident in who I am. And making it more complicated can, in some strange sense, protect me from the very thing that I'm being asked to do. That was the conviction that pierced my heart this morning as I was reading 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul is talking to the church of Thessalonica, and he's reminding them of the time that he was when he was with them. He's describing different things. He says, like in verse 5, he says, we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. No, verse 7, instead, we were like young children among you. He's describing how they functioned whenever they, Paul and Silas and Timothy, were amongst the Christians or amongst the people in Thessalonica that became the church of Thessalonica, witnessing to them, evangelizing to them. At the second half of verse 7, he says, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. And then he says this in verse 8. All of these different descriptions, all of these abstract metaphors, this is what he then summarizes it with. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, not only preaching the gospel message, not only evangelizing with all of the apologetics and all of the passages and all, not only the gospel of God, but we also shared with you our lives. You see, evangelism is not as hard as we want it to be. It's actually not that complicated. Sure, you share with them the gospel. You share with them the good news that Jesus Christ loves us so much that he became flesh, descended into our brokenness, and then died for us in our place so that we can have eternal life with God. But you want to know where that message is most heard, where it is most clearly understood, where it is most clearly impacting for the people that don't know Jesus? That gospel only makes sense when it is in the context of the life of the Christian. Here's the bad news of the good news. Christians, if we want to get better at evangelizing, we need to share our lives more with people that are far from Jesus. We need to share our lives more with the broken. Oftentimes, we don't know what to say to our neighbor because we're only looking for an argument to be able to satisfy with some sort of magic gospel arrow. But if you sat down and you shared with that non-Christian what you struggle with, what your successes are, your story, if you sit down and you listen to them intently, tell their story and what they struggle with, if you actually create a context where you're eating meals together and you know the names of their children and you know the middle names of their family and you know their birthdays and you know their anniversaries and you know the difficulties they have with certain family members, and you know whenever they're losing their job because you're one of the first people they call, that is the foundation. That is the soil within which the seeds of the gospel can actually grow. And that's what Paul is calling us to here. Through example, he reminds this Thessalonican church that we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, not only saying a word, but our lives as well. And then he says this, surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. He starts to describe their struggles. They know it because he shared it with them. And most of us overcomplicate evangelism because we're insecure about our lives. We don't share our lives because we're afraid of what people will find. My challenge for you this week is this. Stop overcomplicating evangelism. And instead, open your lives up to the people around you the way that Paul opened his lives up to those that didn't know Jesus. Sharing with them, loving them, providing for them, and having them also meet your needs. And it's in this shared life that you will find the gospel simply grows. I love you guys. Have a good week.